Smith's Wealth of Nations, Aristotle's Politics, and Tocqueville's Democracy in America. And then a couple of brief references to good books. Anthony Croneman's Education's End, and Leo Strauss's Liberalism, Ancient and Modern. But let me, without spending more time just telling you what I'm going to do, just go ahead and do it. There's been a lot of talk early in this presidential campaign season about higher education. Senator Marco Rubio says he has what he calls a 21st century plan that will, as he puts it, fundamentally overhaul higher education to change how we provide degrees, how those degrees are accessed, how much that access costs, how those costs are paid, and even how those payments are determined. Senator Bernie Sanders has proposed a bill that would provide free tuition at all public colleges and universities. Hillary Clinton has proposed what she calls a new college compact that addresses access, cost, indebtedness, and college completion. Carly Fiorina, remember her, does not have a full-blown plan, but she has argued that, in effect, opening up competition and reducing regulation in higher education would drive down costs. I could go on. You would hear more of the same on one side or the other from candidates and policymakers all across the country. Everyone talks about cost, access, and completion. They rarely, if ever, talk about the purpose and content of higher education. I'm reminded in this connection of something that Jean-Jacques Rousseau says in his Discourse on the Arts and Sciences. The ancient politicians forever spoke of morals and virtue. Ours speak only of commerce and money. Virtually all the current political talk about higher education treats of it as an indispensable instrument for personal financial advancement and national economic competitiveness. So I suppose there is an implicit understanding of higher education in all this. It is to make individuals more productive and wealthier, and the nation more productive and wealthier. There's little or no talk about education character, or about education and citizenship, or about education and learning as an end in itself. Of that, I suppose we should perhaps be grateful. Because most of the time when political leaders say anything about the content of higher education, it sounds illiberal and indeed sometimes even anti-intellectual. Thus, we heard Florida Governor Rick Scott say that we don't need a lot more anthropologists in the state. Florida's overrun by anthropologists. Other things, I want to spend our dollars giving people science, technology, engineering, and math degrees, the famous STEM degrees. That's what our kids need to focus all their time and attention on, so that when they get out of school, they can get a job. Wisconsin Governor Scott Walker provoked quite a controversy when he tried to change the mission of the University of Wisconsin system from the high-minded goals of searching for the truth and improving the human condition to more pedestrian and meeting the state's workforce needs. Senator Marco Rubio likes to crack jokes about how tight the market is for majors in Greek philosophy. And he professes to believe that we have too many philosophy majors and too few trained welders. Most recently, just last month, new Kentucky Governor Scott Bevin announced a plan to reward public colleges and universities that produce graduates with degrees in things people want. By which he means, or at least the only example he gave, was electrical engineering. And, I'm sorry, Dr. Lex, most emphatically, not French literature. Now, the irony here is that Bevin himself has a degree in East Asian Studies from Washington and Lee University. Not exactly, Podunk U, and not exactly, Podunk Tech. And now I've picked on Republicans, so I need to pick on a Democrat. President Obama said some very harsh things about art history. Largely on the ground that you can't make a whole lot of money with a degree in art history. Tell that to a high school friend of mine who has a degree in art history from Mount Holyoke and is the VP of a major commercial real estate company in New York City. Now, okay, so he's wrong, at least anecdotally. Now, to be sure, there have been a few occasions when our political leaders have not stooped so low. Carly Fiorina seems to believe, for example, that her undergraduate degree in medieval history from Stanford actually prepares her to face and to name the evils perpetrated by ISIS. To be sure, she did not undertake this study because of its real-world relevance. On the contrary, this is what she said. I thought of college as a time for pure learning. My parents encouraged this approach, and so I had the wonderful experience of studying the subjects that truly interested me. I took classes in chemistry, biology, physics, economics, anthropology, astronomy, music. Note she doesn't mention medieval history. Now, I actually hasten to add that Carly Fiorina's father was a law professor, so you know, I think there was a kind of sympathy for this kind of education in the family. Now, she hasn't proposed her education as a model of a new federal approach, but she at least does not assume that we should choose our fields of study in accordance with what the marketplace needs now, as if we can predict with sufficient certainty what we will need to know in 5 or 10 or 20 years down the road. I also note in passing that Carly Fiorina would not be the first quote-unquote medieval historian, if I may so describe someone with undergraduate training, to come to public prominence. Here's a name no one here, well, I don't know, maybe not no one. Has anyone here heard of Barbara Conable? Can I see a show of hands? No? Conable was the one-time ranking minority member of the House Ways and Means Committee, so he was one of the chief tax writers in the country. And after he left the House, he went on to become president of the World Bank. He, I think, majored in medieval history at Cornell. Now, Fiorina, if elected, which is, of course, extremely unlikely, would not be the first avid student of history to occupy the Oval Office. Now, I don't know that these names are going to be a ringing endorsement of people who, for historians, but among relatively recent presidents, Harry S. Truman, Richard Nixon, and George W. Bush were all avid readers of history. So, you know, you can get a liberal education and become president of the United States. Now, before I leave our contemporary politicians behind, I wish to single out for praise one additional statement. This one from President Obama. And he says this: "It's not just sometimes folks who are mad that colleges are too liberal that have a problem. Sometimes there are folks on college campuses who are liberal and maybe even agree with me on a bunch of issues, who sometimes aren't listening to the other side. And that's a problem too. I've heard of some college campuses where they don't want to have a guest speaker who's too conservative, or they don't want to read a book that has language that is offensive to African Americans or somehow sends a demeaning signal towards women. I've got to tell you, I don't agree with that either. I don't agree that you, when you become students at college, just have to be coddled and protected from different points of view. Hence, you have to listen to me." While not offering a sturdy programmatic statement about the nature and importance of liberal education, the President does capture at least one element that is essential to it. To be liberally educated is precisely not to be, quote, protected from different points of view, unquote, but rather to examine them all critically so as to be able to think for and ultimately to govern oneself. I'm getting ahead of myself here. Let me try first to offer a partial explanation for the narrowness of our politicians' typical approach to higher education. Then I'll attempt to explain why that vision is not adequate, either as an account of education sub specie aeternatis, or as a prescription for what we need to know here and now. I do not mean, by the way, that we necessarily need fewer welders and more philosophy majors or anthropologists or art historians or students of French literature. There's surely a place in an educational system as diverse and profligate as ours for all of the above. And finally, I'd like to make a case for the importance of a genuinely liberal education as a quote-unquote luxury good, one that, given our productive economy, however straitened as in some cases it might be, we can still afford. In making these arguments, I'll borrow from a number of sources, including Adam Smith, Aristotle, Alexis de Tocqueville, and Leo Strauss, as I said, which is to say that I'll some measure rely on my own liberal education to make the case for it. Now let me start by talking about what I would call higher education and the politics of prosperity. Recall the line from Rousseau I quoted a few moments ago. The ancient politicians spoke forever of morals and of virtue. Ours speak only of commerce and money. While it would take me too far afield to explain how we got here, I think Rousseau's observation is largely correct, even for our time. It is a truism of political science, for example, that presidencies rise and fall with the economic fortunes of the electorate. We quite frequently measure our political health in economic terms, like the quarterly rate of economic growth, housing starts, unemployment figures, and new unemployment compensation claims. In 1980, Ronald Reagan famously asked us whether we were better off than we were 4 years ago. I take it for granted that he wasn't asking us primarily if we were wiser, or more moral, or better citizens. If, for better or worse, our focus is on economic growth and prosperity, it's only natural that it become one of the principal lenses through which we view education. And in this connection, it seems to me that reflecting on Adam Smith's Wealth of Nations offers us some insight into how education and the creation of wealth are connected. Anyone who has glanced at that work knows that for Smith, the source of the wealth of nations is the productivity unleashed by the division of labor. Above all else, then, it seems that we should specialize, cultivating and acquiring the capacity to do one thing extremely well. This, of course, benefits us insofar as we become as productive as possible, making the most of it at least for all to enjoy, presumably at a lower cost. Furthermore, to answer the question of what precisely we should specialize in, the only plausible answer is that whatever helps us produce most efficiently what most people happen at the moment to want. So we take our cue from the marketplace. Implications for higher education of this line of thinking should be obvious when we consider how various are frequently portrayed in the popular media. We are told which jobs and hence which majors are hot, that is, for which there seems to be a lot of demand in the employment marketplace. And we're told which graduates with which degrees can command the highest starting salaries, which is basically another way of saying the same thing. The only gesture made in the direction of what was traditionally called liberal learning is something like the following argument. Experience tells us that people will work in a variety of jobs over their lifetime, so that what is really important is the acquisition of generic transferable skills like communication and critical thinking, which can be cultivated in almost any major taught well, or at least taught in a particular way. According to this argument, developing a particular narrow skill, the ability, say, to write computer programs in two ancient computer languages like COBOL and Fortran, my dad learned that back in the early 60s, is perhaps based on the perhaps mistaken assumption that what is in demand today will also be in demand tomorrow, or next week, or next month, or next year. A student who knew something, say, about the history of science and technology might be wary of focusing the lion's share of his or her efforts on mastering a particular technique or technology that happens to be, at the moment, in high demand. Rather, students should learn to learn. I can't tell you, with apologies to our provost here, how many deans, presidents, and admissions directors I've heard make some version of this argument. And having now shepherded 2 children off to college, it's not just at Oglethorpe, it's every place. All you see the same things, the generic skills. But further consideration of Smith's account of the division of labor takes us beyond these straightforward arguments for and against academic and economic specialization. First, part of Smith's account of the great productivity that follows from the division of labor emphasizes the role machines play in promoting it. Many of these machines, he says, are the inventions of those who are narrowly focused on their own small part of the productive process. But some are, as he puts it, the result of the ingenuity of, and here I'm quoting, those who are called philosophers or men of speculation, whose trade it is not to do anything but to observe everything. And who upon that account are often capable of combining together the powers of the most distant and dissimilar objects. The productivity of the division of labor depends in part on the contributions of people who seem, at least at first glance, to be unspecialized. How else to combine together the powers of the most distant and dissimilar objects? To be sure, Smith cannot and does not resist the logic of his argument for specialization, insisting soon after he makes this point that philosophy itself becomes an object of specialization, so that these observers of distant and dissimilar objects are themselves specialists of a sort. Indeed, Smith goes even further and insists that this specialization is a good thing, as he puts it, it considerably increases the quantity of science. Stated another way, Smith foresees the passing of the 18th century philosophy professor, like himself in Glasgow or Immanuel Kant in Königsberg, who thought about, taught about, and wrote about a wide range of subjects in favor of a narrow academic specialist who might only focus on ethics, metaphysics, epistemology, philosophy, religion, or physics, or biology, or chemistry, or more narrowly specialized than that. No one can deny that the quantity of science has thereby been increased. But what happens to the combination of the powers of distant and dissimilar objects? Because this is what is meant by our currently fashionable interdisciplinarity, by the creation of new quote-unquote disciplines like neuroscience, biostatistics, and so on? Perhaps. But I cannot help but think that there remains room in Smith's account for a kind of serendipity, when a person who goes against the grain of our emphasis on specialization just happens to discover something that we who assiduously tend our own specialized disciplinary gardens could not, or would not, or could not notice. Indeed, later in The Wealth of Nations, Smith returns to the issue of the division of labor, considering it from the perspective of its intellectual effort, or its intellectual effect on those who specialize, who become, as he puts it in a famous passage, as stupid and ignorant as it is possible for a human creature to become. become. Viewed in this way, we, or perhaps many of us, pay a very high price, perhaps too high a price, for our great wealth and productivity. But, Smith continues, in a civilized state, this is quoting Smith, though there is little variety in the occupations of the greater part of individuals, there is an almost infinite variety in those of the whole society. These varied occupations present an almost infinite variety of objects to the contemplation of those few who, being attached to no particular occupation themselves, have leisure and inclination to examine the occupations of other people. The contemplation of so great a variety of objects necessarily exercises their minds in endless comparisons and combinations, and renders their understandings, in an extraordinary degree, both acute and comprehensive. Here we see, I think, the place of serendipity. A wealthy society leaves room for a wide range of human pursuits, productive and unproductive alike. To be sure, there is a strong emphasis on and support for those activities and studies that meet the marketplace demands of the moment. That's inevitable. But so long as there's neither coercion nor exclusion, some at least will be relatively indifferent to the signals of price and salary, either because they've been born well, or because they are, so to speak, wired to respond to other incentives. Welders who make a whole lot more money than I do, but you can't pay me enough to be a welder. And you can't pay insurance premiums high enough to have me welding for you. From Smith's point of view, the important consideration here is to keep the government out of it, to let the invisible hand work its magic. For when the government decides to pick winners to promote what it regards as productive activities and studies and exclude or marginalize apparently unproductive activities and studies, it lays claim to a knowledge that it inevitably lacks. As Smith once put it, I have never known much good to be done by those who affected to trade for the public good. Let me conclude this portion of my talk by using the logic of the Smithian marketplace against those who purport to be speaking on his behalf. The governors, senators, and so on. It may seem that our contemporary politicians are, for the most part, spokesmen for the demands of the market, advocating for productive as opposed to unproductive labor. But they seem to have forgotten, or perhaps never to have learned, that among the ranks of Smith's unproductive laborers, right alongside opera divas, actors, buffoons, and college professors, are politicians. If they took their own argument truly seriously as Adam Smith took it, they would recognize the unproductive or perhaps even destructive character of much of what they do. Rather than acting as spokespeople for the market, they should perhaps just step aside and let the market speak for itself. We consumers may be wrong, sometimes spectacularly wrong, about what we want or should want. But the market is a harsh and unforgiving grader. And we are eventually compelled to learn our lessons, which is just another way of saying the market is self-correcting. Those who make mistakes go out of business. If they're ambitious, get into a new line of work. We all keep at it until someone gets it right. By contrast, politicians and those who seek to influence them, claiming to trade for the public good, as Smith puts it, are disinclined to let anyone fail, least of all themselves. Political power thus tends to protect and enshrine potentially bad ideas. And of course, now I sound like a libertarian or perhaps a public choice economist, which I perish the thought. Not exactly the message I want to send. Permit me the following Smithian self-correction. Despite his praise of the market and deprecation of the unproductive character of government, Smith recognizes that government does have some necessary functions, among them providing the general education that corrects for the stultification born of the division of labor, which I've already mentioned. I note in passing that unlike some of our contemporary politicians, Smith thinks that the role of government is to help provide a remedy for the human defects produced by the market, not to reinforce or exaggerate them. To be sure, Smith's discussion has more to do with elementary and perhaps secondary education, rather than higher education. And while he might have something in common with administrations celebrate, if at all, the generic methodological instrumental effects of education, the aforementioned communication and critical thinking skills, he does go one significant step further than they do. His principal concern about the baneful human consequence of the division of labor is that it renders us unfit to be citizens. While he might have been most concerned about the martial aspect of citizenship, I plan to speak more about what might be called self-government, the civic, if you will, aspect of citizenship. And here I turn to consideration of Aristotle and Tocqueville. When I talk to students, I often present myself as a critic of democracy. It is not an elevated form of government, and it seems to demand little or nothing of citizens. No one has to take a literacy test, let alone a test of general political knowledge, before voting. And virtually every study of the civic knowledge of contemporary Americans reaches the depressing result that, in the immortal words of Sam Cooke, we don't know much about history, geography, economics, or anything else. It's perhaps no accident that when he defends majority rule, the great English political philosopher John Locke simply argues that it is more powerful or effective than the alternatives, not that it's wiser. But if, as Socrates points out to Thrasymachus in Book 1 of Plato's Republic, those who have power do not actually know what is good for themselves, then they cannot exercise that power in their genuine interest. If I have power and I'm ignorant, then I'm going to use that power poorly. I'm going to hurt myself rather than help myself with power. It's hard to see, in other words, how democracy without some form of education can be good for those who seek to enjoy its fruits. Two of the best examples of how this could work can be found in Aristotle's Politics and Tocqueville's Democracy in America. Let me turn first to Aristotle. In Book 3, Chapter 11 of the Politics, Aristotle makes a very interesting argument on behalf of democracy, which he famously regards as a bad regime, generally speaking. To be sure, he thinks most actually existing regimes are bad regimes, either the selfish rule of the poor, democracy, or the selfish rule of the rich, oligarchy. But in this particular passage, Aristotle argues that in some way, under certain circumstances, the people who typically comprise a democracy could make a claim to legitimate authority that is superior to that of virtually every other contender. The ground on which he makes this claim is knowledge, more precisely the collective knowledge and judgment of the people, who, taken together, know more and judge better than any superlative individual or smaller group. To be sure, Aristotle concedes that not just any majority can display these qualities, but as he puts it, nothing prevents what was said from being true of a certain kind of multitude. This certain kind of multitude consists of those who, first of all, know what they know and also know what they don't know. Deliberating together, each member of the group offers his or her judgment of the part that he or she knows and listens to the contributions of colleagues in areas where they have their expertise. This, I take it, is one of the sources of the case made from time to time by contemporary democratic theorists for what they call deliberative democracy. It sounds almost too good to be true, and Aristotle pretty quickly more or less concedes that it is. Just a few lines later, he reminds us that as individuals, those who comprise the multitude cannot be trusted with holding office on their own, but also asserts that excluding them altogether from a share in political authority is a matter for alarm. For when there exist men who are deprived of prerogatives of the poor, that city is necessarily filled with enemies. Fortunately, he continues, there are collective offices in which they can safely and productively share. For all of them, when joined together, as he puts it, have an adequate perception, and once mixed with those who are better, bring benefit to cities. Notice how far his estimation of the capacity of the multitude has fallen. All the way from essentially better than any plausible contender to, in effect, adequate with proper guidance. The guidance, I suggest, comes from those who have a certain sort of education. Indeed, Aristotle's very next arguments take seriously the contention that rendering judgment about political questions requires a certain sort of knowledge, a knowledge that is possessed not only by credentialed experts, who maybe only political scientists should be about, but also by those who are, as he puts it, educated with respect to a subject. While it might be tempting to say that the wise exercise of political authority requires the virtually impossible rule of Platonic philosopher kings, for whom professional experts in public administration and public policy are most emphatically not substitutes, Aristotle here makes the case for the capacity of liberally educated citizens who know enough about a subject to understand and assess the positions taken by the experts. This is more than purely egalitarian common sense, or the consumer sovereignty of everyone being the best judge of what's good for himself or herself. Aristotle makes a gesture in the direction of this latter position, but certainly does not unequivocally endorse it. Rather, he points to the direction of a sort of politically responsible general knowledge that well-educated citizens can acquire without distorting their learning in such ways to become narrowly specialized experts. This last point bears a little further exploration. At the conclusion of his discussion of the role of knowledge in politics, Aristotle offers 3 examples of how those who may be called non-experts can judge the work of experts. The household manager is a better judge of a house than the one who built it. The pilot is a better judge of a rudder than the carpenter who made it. And diners are better judges of a meal than is the cook. Of the 3, only the last example is purely egalitarian, as everyone, of course, has his or her own taste. In the first 2 cases, we see that the so-called non-experts have a different sort of knowledge, either the nature and well-being of the household or the safety and navigation of a ship. Neither one possesses necessarily a narrow technical expertise. Both have responsibility for others under their care or under their supervision. In the former case, that of the household, the goal seems to be the virtue and happiness of the members of the household. In the latter, it's the safe navigation of the ship. It's possible to regard both of these, the household and the ship, as analogs for politics. And indeed, these analogs for politics are common in Plato, in Xenophon, and in Aristotle. So Aristotle's argument, I think, in the final analysis is there is a kind of liberally acquired, or liberally educated acquired political knowledge that enables us to assess and make good use of the technical information the experts give us. We certainly need the technical expertise, but we also need the kind of general knowledge that's the product of liberal education. Tocqueville also has some thoughts on the nature and character of the curriculum necessary for educating citizens, especially in a democracy like that found in America. He notes quite frequently that there is little genuine diversity of thought in America, in large part because we as individuals lack the resources to think for ourselves. Of course, that's only the most general way of putting it. In particular, because we all have to work for a living, we lack the time and the inclination to engage in the kind of deep theoretical inquiry that conduces to the production of new, different, and interesting ideas. Instead, Tocqueville says, we buy our opinions off the shelf from the majority. As he puts it, in the United States, the majority takes charge of furnishing individuals with a host of ready-made opinions, and thus it relieves them of the obligation to form their own. There are a great number of theories on matters of philosophy, morality, or politics that everyone thus adopts without examination on the faith of the public. In addition, we lack the secure self-confidence to disagree with the majority of our fellows, on whose approbation we depend. Here's how Tocqueville chillingly characterizes this aspect of what he calls tyranny of the majority. In our day, civilization has perfected even despotism itself, he says, which seemed to have nothing more to learn. Princes had, so to speak, made violence material. Democratic republics in our day have rendered it just as intellectual as the human will it wants to constrain. Under the absolute government of one alone, despotism struck the body cruelly so as to reach the soul. And the soul, escaping from those blows, rose gloriously above it. But in democratic republics, tyranny does not proceed in this way. It leaves the body and goes straight for the soul. The master no longer says to it, you shall think as I do, or you shall die. He says, you're free not to think as I do. Your life, your goods, everything remains to you. But from this day on, you are a stranger among us. Go in peace. I leave you your life, but I leave it to you worse than death. Thus, Tocqueville says, as he puts it, there's no freedom of mind in America. On the contrary, what we have come to call political correctness is, as it were, the occupational hazard of democratic citizenship for Tocqueville. To summarize, in America, Tocqueville found immense pressures, some benign and some insidious, toward an intellectual conformity that would diminish the human spirit and lead us to squander the liberty that is our birthright. But he also identified the counterweights, and this is where colleges and universities come in, or at least where they ought to come in. First, to the degree that we are all prey to the demand for practicality, to the degree that we are all always busy acquiring credentials, and or deploying them in order to make a living, we need the kind of leisure that genuinely higher education can afford us. Some students, at least, need to be told that the constant credential-oriented agitation that has marked their lives as what New York Times columnist David Brooks once called organization kids should be suspended in favor of inquiry, thought, and discussion. The busyness will resume soon enough, but they have an opportunity to build up a kind of intellectual capital to sustain their individuality and freedom as they proceed through life. That's what college is for. College students today can have a remarkable opportunity to be provoked into thinking for themselves, into examining and debating a variety of ways regarding the world, if only they took the time. Tocqueville also has some advice about what to do with this leisure. And here he says, in our day, one must detain the human mind in theory. It runs of itself to practice. And instead of constantly leading it back toward the detailed examination of secondary effects, it is good to distract it from them sometimes in order to raise it to the contemplation of first causes. Our students' tendency is to seek the pragmatic and the useful, the prepare themselves for the life of work that awaits them. Regarded in this respect, higher education is a kind of advanced trade school dedicated to the preparation of young professionals. While it would be folly simply to ignore this tendency, we educators should engage in a bit of pushback, insisting on the importance of theory for its own sake as an end in itself. Stated another way, colleges and universities can play an important role in a democratic society by being, as it were, countercultural. I don't mean to urge a return to the manner of the 60s, which all too often simply exaggerated a certain kind of immediate pragmatism. If it feels good, do it, is a plausible predecessor to the thought that the one who dies with the most toys wins. Rather, I think colleges and universities can pull a little away from the immediately practical, insisting upon the importance of the permanent things that provide the anchor for human freedom and individuality against the pressure of the everyday. Tocqueville even has some suggestions for a kind of countercultural curriculum. People in democratic ages, he says, should read Greek and Latin authors, for they call our attention to the importance of individuals, to their potency, and to their consequent responsibility. By contrast, for example, modern historians tend to present individuals as victims of mass movements and impersonal social forces. We need reasons for taking responsibility for ourselves. We need examples to inspire us to do so, not excuses for why we cannot. At the same time, Tocqueville doesn't think such an education is for everyone. Given the fact that most of us are compelled by our circumstances to work for a living, a simply literary education that focused on quote-unquote great books would not be appropriate if adopted and propagated on a mass scale. If one persisted, he says, in teaching only belles lettres, in a society where each one was habitually led to make violent efforts to increase his fortune or to maintain it, one would have very polite but very dangerous citizens. For every day the social and political state would give them needs that they would never learn to satisfy by education. And they would trouble the state in the name of the Greeks and Romans instead of making it fruitful by their industry. If you have too many philosophy majors who work at baristas at Starbucks, they're going to be unhappy. You don't want that. Perhaps Marco Rubio is right. Some of those who study Greek philosophy would serve themselves and society better by being welders. If liberal education leads to Occupy Wall Street, then perhaps many of us should stick with STEM or perhaps go to trade school. It's evident, Tocqueville continues, that in democratic centuries, the interest of individuals, as well as the security of the state, requires that the education of the greatest number be scientific, commercial, and industrial, rather than literary. Greek and Latin ought not to be taught in all schools, he says. But it's important that those whose nature or whose fortune destines them to cultivate letters, or predisposes them to that taste, find schools in which one can be made a perfect master of ancient literature and wholly steeped in its spirit. To attain this result, excellent universities would be worth more than a multitude of bad colleges, where superfluous studies that are done badly prevent necessary studies from being done well. We can glean from this passage the following two pieces of advice I submit. First, there has to be an education available for some, quote, whose nature or whose fortune destines them to cultivate letters or predisposes them to that taste. There have to be excellent liberal arts colleges or programs. I say programs as a gesture to the research-oriented state and private universities, for those who can take advantage of them. And that cohort includes the poor but gifted or interested and the well-to-do. It's not just a matter of class and resources. This requires a diverse array of colleges and programs, few in number perhaps, but accessible to all who seek them out. Second, the colleges and programs that provide this education cannot themselves be oriented toward the marketplace, whose demands are more likely to not reflect the spirit of the time, rather than being, as it were, countercultural. The student cannot be treated as a sovereign consumer, but rather as someone who does not quite know what he needs. The curriculum, in other words, would resemble more closely that of the famous Great Books program at St. John's College, where virtually everything is prescribed, rather than that of Harvard, where a cafeteria system of electives prevails. I should add that in this day and age, the cafeteria system is more market-friendly. It makes students happy by enabling them to pick their poisons, avoiding in some measure courses and subjects they dislike, and focusing on those that are to their taste. Education that proceeds in this way cannot really be countercultural. Furthermore, we professors tend to like that kind of education as well. We teach more or less what we want to students who more or less like it. Our course evaluations are likely to be better as a result, and our course preparation less burdensome and less likely to interfere with our research such as it is. We're absolved of any compulsion to think about what it is our students and our society really need, asking ourselves only whether what either what the market demands, or what we like, or what we can get away with. This is, I submit, an abdication of responsibility. I conclude with a brief, and I promise it's relatively brief. This looks like a lot, but it's big print because I have bad eyesight. I conclude with a brief and necessarily inadequate reflection on two short essays written by Leo Strauss. They are titled, What is Liberal Education? And Liberal Education Responsibility. They were delivered more than 50 years ago. Let me begin by quoting a passage from the first essay, written in 1959, where Strauss offers a definition of what he means by liberal education here and now, which is to say, in Chicago, in one way or another, a philosophy, from the religious illusions, whether pagan or Christian, entertained by the many. In the Judeo-Christian world, this meant that those who held positions of responsibility in society always took a wider view than people at large. But the Enlightenment revolt against Christendom deconstructed the traditional sources of authority and claimed also to efface the distinction between the few and the many. We are left with education for the sake of narrow technical expertise, interested in serving anyone and everyone with the means to command it, and with the abolition of the old moral teachings, replaced in the end by nothing more than enlightened self-interest, which cannot really stand up against the power of human desire. As Strauss put it in the second essay, published in 1962, instead of the fruitful and ennobling tension between religious education and liberal education, we now see the tension between the ethos of democracy and the ethos of technocracy. What is peculiar to our age, or characteristic of our age, he says, is, as he puts it, the interplay of mass taste with high-grade, but strictly speaking, unprincipled efficiency. Now, Strauss laments the decline of religious education and this kind of fruitful tension. Longtime Yale law professor and mainstay of Yale's great books-oriented directed studies program, Anthony, his recent Education's End, that the cultivation, as he puts it, of the humanities comprised one effort to address this issue. If religion and philosophy or philosophical theology do not exist in a fruitful and ennobling tension, if God is dead, at least in the academy, then all that remains is some sort of humanistic education to pick up the slack, providing the counterpart to the high-grade, strictly speaking, unprincipled efficiency. To be sure, Kroneman argues that even that effort has fallen prey to a kind of specialization and professionalization, with scholars in literature, philosophy, and history imitating their more prestigious and better-funded colleagues in the sciences. Everyone has science and doctoral rules. We seem to be back where we began, with specialization ruling the day and no compelling alternative to it capable of providing a humanizing leaven, enabling us to govern ourselves. Now, Strauss doesn't share Kroneman's gloom, perhaps because it was 40 years earlier. The openness, he says, of democracy, and as I argued earlier, the profligacy of our modern economy, quote, gives freedom to those who care for human excellence. No one prevents us from cultivating our garden or setting up outposts, which may come to be regarded by many citizens as salutary to the Republic and as deserving of giving it its tone. He harbors no illusions about the universality of liberal education. It, as he puts it, will always remain the obligation and the privilege of a minority. But because it appeals to permanent human longings and addresses permanent human questions, he believes, it can survive, even in an economy and a culture that militate against it. Note also that he says that the outposts of liberal education, as he puts it, may come to be regarded by many citizens as salutary to the Republic and as deserving of giving to it its tone. This makes it sound as if, at its core, the purpose of liberal education is to be a form of civic education, edifying and ennobling to the Republic that is its host or its home. But Strauss eschews any such expectation or intention. We cannot expect that liberal education will lead all who benefit from it to understand their civic responsibility in the same way or to agree politically. There is, and perhaps ought not to be, there is not, and perhaps ought not to be, a party of liberal education. After all, as much as anything else, liberal education consists in a serious contemplation of serious alternatives, where reasonable and thoughtful people will inevitably disagree about where the balance of considerations fall, and about what the implications of any plausible position are for our circumstances here and now. Still, he does suggest that our recent experiences, he mentions the political effects of Marx and Nietzsche, both, as he puts it, and this is chastening, liberally educated on a level to which we cannot even hope to aspire, may lead us, I'm quoting him again, to understand again the old saying that wisdom cannot be separated from moderation, and that wisdom requires unhesitating loyalty to a decent constitution, and even to the cause of constitutionalism. Here's my takeaway from Strauss. Liberal education proceeds, as I put it earlier, sub specie etugnatus, examining and contemplating eternal questions that take us away from the everyday. But every quote-unquote outpost of liberal education and every liberally educated person lives in a particular time and place. Those of us who inhabit these outposts have to be aware that we exist at the sufferance of the communities and nations in which we are located. We have to remember that we are members of those communities and citizens of those nations. If we cannot persuade the majority of our fellows who are not liberally educated that our enterprise is quote-unquote salutary to the Republic, if we put ourselves in a position to be casually dismissed in the way that most politicians currently dismiss the liberal arts, then we do not deserve to survive, let alone to thrive. This does not require that we accommodate ourselves to the tenor of the times, telling people what we think they want to hear. But it does require that we avoid what Strauss calls the unmanly contempt for politics. We have to display and genuinely feel the respect for the ordinary concerns of ordinary citizens, not just because these may provide fodder for our discourses, but also because as neighbors and fellow citizens, we share them, even as we're drawn to something perhaps higher. Rather than simply dismissing and deprecating our culture and our politics as crass, vulgar, wrong-headed, or oppressive, rather than taking the adversarial stance that is so common in the contemporary academy, we can attempt to show how it reflects and points to the highest and most important human concerns, with good and evil, just and unjust, right and wrong. This undertaking is, as I said, not for everyone. We should not expect it to be. But there is a way in which its effects can be felt by all, so long as the liberally educated and the liberal educators do not forget that they are friends, neighbors, and fellow citizens.